Welcome back for another Sheriff of Sodium video. Caveat emptor, how to give premeds the residency placement data they deserve. Caveat emptor, of course, is Latin for let the buyer beware. It's a term that persists today in contract law, but it originates in ancient Rome. And the premise is that if you went down to Trajan's market to buy yourself a new centurion helmet or a bust of Caesar Augustus, well, it's incumbent upon you as the buyer to inspect those items carefully and determine their quality before you put your money down. Because if you get home and the bust cracks, or you discover that that helmet is made out of flimsy tin and it's not going to protect your skull when you go into battle with some Visigoth or Hun, well, that's on you. Because you, as the purchaser of those goods, you are solely responsible for carefully examining the quality and judging what's best for you. And so if you decide later on that the goods that you purchased aren't as good as you thought they'd be, well, unless you explicitly negotiated for some kind of warranty from the seller, that's just tough luck. There's no backsies. I usually hear this phrase from someone in medical education one time a year. And the time I hear it is right after match day. Because after match day, there's usually a lot of discussion about unmatched applicants. And most of the time, these conversations and news stories and social media posts, they generate a certain amount of sympathy, but not always. So there's always at least one person who points out, they slide into my DMs to say, caveat emptor. These applicants should have known they weren't going to match. They went to a no-name medical school and they're trying to match dermatology. They went to a DO school, they're trying to match orthopedics. They went to a Caribbean medical school, they're trying to match in anything at all. They took on the risk, they knew what they were getting into, and they got what they should have known they were going to get when they chose to enroll there 4 years ago. Caveat emptor. So let me say from the outset that I'm highly sympathetic to unmatched applicants. But there's a part of this, there's a little part of this that rings true for me. Because in reality, we're just simply not ever going to live in a world in which everyone who wants to be an orthopedic surgeon or a dermatologist is going to get that opportunity. Nor would we necessarily want to live in such a world, even if it could be made to exist. And any serious person knows that you can't simply increase the number of residency positions until every single applicant gets one. You increase the number of positions, you're going to increase the supply of applicants, and you're going to be in a never-ending cycle. But the reason this resonates with me is because, all of us every day in ways that are big and small, we choose a certain level of risk that we're comfortable with. Let me use myself as an example. I've been in practice for about 10 years. If I had decided at the beginning to put all of my retirement savings in Bitcoin, I probably could have retired by now. I mean, at least I probably could have retired if I'd cashed out in 2021. If I'd chosen from the very beginning to take on this high risk, high reward strategy, I could I could have reaped the rewards of it. And if I did, I'd be rich and retired, and everybody would think I was some kind of investment genius. But I also could have taken on that high risk, high reward path and lost everything. And if I did, should you feel sorry for me? I mean, if I lost all my retirement savings day trading or spending it all on some off-brand cryptocurrency and I lost everything, would you feel sorry for me if I had to suddenly work until I was 75 or eat cat food as a retired person? You probably wouldn't. I mean, caveat emptor, you'd say. And as a matter of principle, I believe that if people know what they're getting into and they want to take on a risk, I've got no problem with it. I actually kind of admire it, if I'm being honest, because I'm actually a pretty risk averse person, and I have a certain admiration for those of you who have the courage and self conviction to see a little narrow path to a goal, that something you want, and you take that narrow path and you push with everything you got to get it. But all this supposes that people know what they're getting into. And unfortunately, not many pre-meds have a clue how the match works, or how there's a certain risk that they're going to struggle to get a job after medical school, or how it may actually be impossible for them to get a job in the specialty that they dreamed of when they imagined themselves as a doctor one day and applied to medical school. So if you know the odds and you know what you're getting into, and you're one of these beautiful people who sees that the odds are long, but you believe that you're a winner and that you're going to be the exception to the rule, and you want to go for it, I say go for it. Chase your dreams. I'm going to cheer for you, and I'll celebrate with you when you succeed. And if you don't succeed, I mean, look, I'm still going to be sad for you. I'm going to be sad it didn't work out, but Although I'll be sad, I will not feel that some massive systemic change is necessary because you knew what you were doing. You went for it on fourth and long, and sometimes you convert that down, and sometimes you don't. But the key thing here is that you have to know, or you have to at least be given the opportunity to know what it is that you're getting into. So I bristled a little bit when I saw this article from the AAMC, which came out about a week ago. It says, as more medical schools withdraw from the U.S. News rankings, how should prospective students decide where to apply? I guess the first thing that I got to note before I move on is that the premise here is faulty, as if the U.S. News rankings were exactly where a pre-med should turn to decide where to apply. And I guess I'll save this tirade for another time, but if you look at the U.S. News rankings in even the most cursory way, you will see that almost none of the variables have anything to do with the actual experience of going to school there. They consider things that happen before you even enter the school, like your GPA or MCAT, and they consider things that really exist externally to the whole educational apparatus, like the amount of NIH funding that people that are in other buildings that you'll never go into, pipetting things, and you're never going to interact with them in any way. It considers how much money they got from the NIH. Um, U.S. News scarcely considers anything that's an important educational input or output, and it certainly doesn't measure the kind of education that's going to occur in the school while you're there. So the problem with using the U.S. News and World Rankings to gauge the quality of education you're going to get as a medical student, well, folks, that has nothing to do with whether Harvard or Stanford are going to submit their data anymore or not. If all you're looking for is a list of the most famous and prestigious institutions in medicine, U.S. News will happily sell you that, and they'll continue to sell you that, even if certain schools say that they're no longer playing. But I digress. Back to the article. The article's lead-in promises that admissions officers and deans are going to offer their insider tips on what students should consider and where to find that information. So I read with great interest. And one of the admissions deans, they recommended that prospective students should look at residency placement. So the article says, seeing where a school's graduates get placed through the National Resident Matching Program can give applicants an idea of where they're likely to match for residencies, the dean says. Some schools provide statistics every year showing the hospitals and specialties their graduates matched into. The dean urges applicants to look at several years of data to see consistencies over time. And this is sage advice, I'm sure. There's just one problem. Almost no schools provide this data. Yes, there are some schools that put together their match list and they email it out to the class, and sometimes people post that to Reddit or Student Doctor Network. But the schools themselves almost never put out a complete match list. Now, there are exceptions, I'm sure. But if you want to take the Pepsi challenge, then go for it. Good luck finding this information for the overwhelming majority of medical schools in this country. You're not even going to find 1 year's match list for most schools. So good luck finding several years of match data to see consistencies over time. To the extent that schools say anything about their match results, they usually will give you some generic statements about how 98% or 100% of their students matched, or they'll highlight a select group of matches to famous institutions as if those are representative of the whole class. And actually, even when schools do provide their match lists, they often fib about it and they cook the books to make themselves look good. Here's one such example. Here's a tweet from a few days ago, put out by an osteopathic medical school that's celebrating. Did you hear? They had a 100% match rate across all 3 campus locations. But there's something funny when you look at their match list. Um, First, there's a lot of people who are listed as having matched into transitional year positions and preliminary year surgery positions. Now, maybe all those applicants are just on their way to ophthalmology or urology positions, and this is just a way station. But for completeness, the school decided to list it on their match list. Um, or maybe some of these applicants actually failed to match in whatever they were trying to get into, and they had to snag a dead end transitional year or prelim position in the SOAP. And actually, these folks are going to be putting together their residency applications again in just a few months to try to secure a residency position that'll actually lead to them becoming board eligible in a recognized specialty. Honestly, it's impossible to know. You see the list, it's impossible to know. It's also impossible to know how many of the categorical placements were actually the desired placements. I mean, maybe someone matched into, let's say, a categorical family medicine program because she dreamed from the time she was a little girl of being a family medicine doctor. Or maybe the same applicant dreamed of being an OBGYN or a radiologist since they were a little girl, and they picked up this family medicine position in the SOAP after they failed to match in their dream specialty. Again, by showing us the list, it's impossible to know. So I'm willing to give the school the benefit of the doubt on those issues. But actually, in this particular situation, the school's match list actually took it one step further and included something that I've never even seen before. Their match list included a list of four positions listed as research year. And it's very difficult for me to explain how any of these positions could truthfully be considered as a match because research positions are not assigned through the NRMP or any other matching service. So I called them out on Twitter gently, and this led to some word games about what they meant by match rate, and then they stopped responding to me altogether. And of course, in the wake of this, I got a DM from an established faculty member who began concern trolling me about how I called out this school by name. And this faculty member, he explained to me, and I don't think he's wrong, that this is a very highly reputable school, and he knows the dean personally, and they place their students very well in the match, and they only have the students' best interests at heart, and that when I single them out, it's unfair, and it makes me look like a bully, and I'm perpetuating anti-DO bias. So I only have two things to say about that. The first one is, it's not about this particular school. I said that explicitly on Twitter and I'll say it again now. It's not about this particular school. Many schools do this, and it's not an MD-DO thing. DO schools, they get caught cooking the books more than MD schools, but that's because they're required as a condition of accreditation to report their match rate. But the MD schools, I'll tell you, they don't tell you nothing. So you can decide for yourself which is better or worse. I'm just going to emphasize again that every school cooks the books. And if you want to know the ways in which they do that, I go through some of it in my Match Day Winners and Losers video, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But again, it's not about this particular school. And the second thing I want to say is this, and this is the very thing that I pointed out to the person who expressed the concern that I was targeting this institution. How do you think I found this tweet? I mean, it may be flattering to think that I'm just out here doggedly following your school's account, just hoping against hope that they'll make some social media misstep and then I can pounce on it for likes. But that's not what happened. The school's own students reached out to me because they were aggrieved and they felt that this was false advertising. And the students tell me that there are multiple students who did not match at each campus and that those students had to suffer through the uncertainties of Soap Week before taking a position that was not on anywhere on their radar before then. And maybe things are going to work out for those students, and maybe they won't. But their career trajectory is certainly took an unexpected and disappointing detour, and it rubs these students the wrong way to see the school gloss over this fact and celebrate the match as if everything is just hunky-dory. So if you're from this school and you feel victimized by someone truthfully and correctly pointing out your misleading social media marketing, I mean, I don't know what to tell you other than you're not the victim here. And that's all I have to say about that. Because now it's time to talk about solutions. And I do think that this is a real problem. Prospective medical students deserve to know realistic outcome data before they choose their medical school. A medical education is a $200,000 to $400,000 investment. Other than their home, it's probably the most expensive thing that a doctor is ever going to purchase during their lifetime. And actually, now that I've said that, comparing it to getting a mortgage on a home is pretty apt comparison because when you get a mortgage on your home, there's an incredible amount of due diligence involved. The seller has to declare anything that they know is wrong with the home. If you're selling a home and you know the foundation is sinking or there's a leak in the roof, you can't just sit back and hope the buyer doesn't notice and then say caveat emptor when they move in and the ceiling falls in on their head or the house falls over on its side. You have to tell that when they're deciding to buy. And even then, we know that sellers have an incentive to lie. So we put in other safeguards. So if you buy a home, guess what? There's going to be a home inspection. where someone comes in, someone whose job it is, comes in and pokes around to see if there's any problems that you ought to know about before you put down your money. And of all the things that you might want to know about a medical school before you decided to go into debt by six figures, one of the most important is probably whether or not you're going to get a return on your investment. How likely is it that you're going to be able to pursue the type of career that you want to pursue when you go into that school? I say that applicants deserve this information, and right now they simply do not have access to it. So what should we do about that? Well, that's what I'm going to do in the rest of this video. I'm going to tell you exactly what I think we should do about this and who should do it. But first, I think we need to say, I'm going to tell you who's not going to fix this problem. The medical schools, they're not going to fix this problem. Um, if you want premeds to get this information, you could ask your deans to provide it. You could go to the next student council meeting or the next town hall meeting with your deans. You could try to shame your school on social media or organize a protest, but that's not going to fix it. It is just simply not in most schools' interests to report honest match outcomes. And it's especially not in their interest to do it when other schools aren't. And that's why we have the system that we have today, where some schools report some sterilized match statistics and others report absolutely nothing. Why would you, though, if you were a dean? Why? Why would you commit to reporting something that may get misinterpreted or it may make you look bad? Why would you do that if you didn't have to? The schools are not going to fix this problem. Now, as a side note, I will say, one of the solutions to caveat emptor problems is for the seller to provide a warranty. And I think that's a separate discussion. But if schools wanted to provide a warranty that you get your money back if you don't match, well, then we're having a different conversation. External regulators, they're also probably not going to fix this problem. Although in theory they could. The Federal Trade Commission has actually pursued a few cases against some Caribbean medical schools for overstating USMLE pass rates and match results because it's true, it's false advertising. So schools who try to market themselves by fibbing about their match results, I think they do put themselves in some potential jeopardy. And if they ask me for my advice on it, I would say don't do that because anybody theoretically could file a complaint with the FTC. And if we're being honest, though, I mean, the violations that the FTC has chosen to pursue, they were pretty egregious. And the penalties that they administered were relatively minor. So it's hard for me to imagine the FTC is going to get interested in trying to bust you for low-level juking the stats, like including people who soaped into prelim positions as if they had matched into their DREAM program. And even if some external regulator did get interested in this problem, the most logical way for schools to protect themselves would be to just stop reporting anything. And that doesn't help premeds any more than they're being helped now. Next, internal regulators are not going to fix this problem. Here I'm talking about accrediting bodies. And they certainly could fix this problem if they wanted to, but they have deliberately chosen not to do anything in this area. So as I mentioned earlier, DO granting schools, they're required by COCA, their accrediting body, to report match rates on the school's website. But COCA has chosen to be toothless in the way that they enforce this. They allow schools to report so-called match rates, which count people who didn't match but Hail Married into a position in the SOAP. They get to be counted as if that was their plan all along. Meanwhile, the LCME, the body that accredits MD schools, has consistently chosen not to require any of this kind of reporting. And that's because they fear that it will lead to harmful gaming by the medical schools. Those concerns, they're credible, and they deserve some discussion because if you require schools to report their match rates, well, you're providing them an incentive to do things that make those match rates look good, even if those things are not in the student's best interests. So it's easy to imagine that medical schools might start requiring students who want to do dermatology or anesthesiology or radiology or surgical specialties. They could start requiring them to apply to a certain number of community internal medicine or pediatrics or family medicine programs as a backup, even if the applicant had zero interest in those specialties. And if those folks don't match into their preferred highly competitive specialty, well, they still may match, and the school will come out looking like a winner. But whether those applicants and their patients are going to win when those applicants get forced into doing a residency and practicing in a field they don't want, well, that's a highly debatable question. Schools could also do other things. They could try to steer their applicants away from more competitive specialties in the first place. And they're in a position to do that in ways that are both subtle and overt. For instance, they could limit access to letters of recommendation, or they could restrict away rotations, except for students that have the shiniest CVs that they think are competitive enough to succeed. And it's because of unintended consequences like this that the LCME has shied away from trying to give pre-meds any help. But that leaves one last hero that could still save us, and that's the NRMP. The NRMP could, if they wanted, share data about each school's residency placement, and their data is the gold standard. If you leave it to schools, they're going to juke the stats, and they're going to count prelim years with no advanced position like it's a success. Or they're going to reclassify students who actually tried and failed to match as if they'd never tried at all. But the NRMP knows how many students applied, and they know how many matched. Even more than that, because they have the rank order lists, they can see whether a student who matched, they can see whether they actually matched into their dream specialty or whether they had to settle for some backup. Maybe a student wanted to be a dermatologist and they matched in internal medicine. Some schools might choose to celebrate that as if it were just an unblemished W. And I don't mean to say it's a bad outcome. I mean, if the applicant ranked an internal medicine program, well, let's trust their judgment. They must have felt that it was better for them to shift direction in their career versus going unmatched altogether. But at the same time, we can be honest about it. It's not what they dreamed of. And I think it's fair to have that kind of data for pre-meds to look at. And the NRP is the only organization that's in a position to separate out those outcomes. They're the only ones who have access to an applicant's rank order list. So dream with me for a minute and imagine a world in which the NRMP issued charting outcomes in the match reports for each medical school. And they might look something like this. Let's say we have a medical school like, State U Medical School. And the NRMP might tell us that they had 140 applicants who applied for the match. And of those 140, 126 matched, 90%, not bad. But of that 90%, 80% actually matched their preferred specialty, the specialty that they ranked number one. And that means that 10%, well, they matched somewhere, but it wasn't the specialty they were trying to get into. And of the 14 students who didn't match, well, 10 of them found positions in the SOAP and they accepted those offers. So that's good for them. And the other four, well, they had to find something else to do. But the NRP could go even farther than that. So imagine that they told us that among these students or among this school students, we could look over a 5-year period and see the match rates for different specialties. Internal medicine, 95%, pediatrics, 96.9%, OBGYN, 65%, orthopedic surgery, 64%. Do you think this kind of information would be useful to pre-meds? I do. I mean, if you know in your heart of hearts that you want to be an orthopedic surgeon, do you want to go to a school where 8% of the graduating class goes into orthopedics or where 1% does? Do you want to go where the match rate is 80%? Or do you want to go where it's 30%? These data would help you make an informed decision before you find yourself $400,000 in the hole. And honestly, even for applicants who aren't hell-bent on some highly competitive specialty, these data still may be helpful. I mean, if you want to do primary care, you might rather go to a school where a large proportion of the class shares that interest and they follow that career path. You may not want to be at a place where the only thing that rates is highly competitive specialties and it's all hustle and grind and everybody's trying to make their way to being a interventional neurocardiothoracic surgical oncologist. It should be obvious that, unlike the self-interested medical schools, the NRMP is a neutral party. So we can trust their data. And they're in a position to be fair. They could report the same data for every school, MD, DO, even international medical schools. If they have people who apply to the match, those data could and should be reported. So why hasn't this happened? I asked a couple of people to answer that question and water test this idea. I mean, what arguments could be advanced against the NRMP truthfully and transparently presenting data like this for each school? And we came up with a few counter arguments, but I think that you'll see that when most of them get examined carefully, they don't hold up that well. Let's start with some easy ones. But we don't need these data. So you can imagine some school official that doesn't want to have their school's residency placement statistics on display, and they could ask, With all sincerity, match rates are good. The NRMP gives you a lot of data. We have charting outcomes in the match. You know it's hard to get into competitive specialties, and match rates for MD and DO seniors, they're pretty good. They're 92, 93%. So, do we really need this? I mean, does it really add anything to what's already out there? Well, I say it does. I mean, like I said before, aside from your mortgage, a medical education is probably the single biggest purchase that most doctors ever make. Applicants should be given the opportunity to do their due diligence. And as an aside, because you don't have to accept this part of the argument to still see this as not a good challenge to my proposition, but as an aside, I personally think that the landscape of medical education is changing. There was a time not that long ago, I mean, maybe back when I was applying for residencies, that there didn't seem like there was that much distance between the most advantaged medical schools and the least. I think that's changing. Over the past 20 years, there's been a dramatic expansion in the number of medical schools in the United States, MD and DO schools alike. And I hope you know me well enough to know that I'm not some elitist who's going to sit here and claim that, older medical schools are better than new ones, or that you can only get a good medical education from certain schools or prestigious schools. But I am a realist. And as a citizen of this real world, I think there are some realities that we ought to acknowledge. And one of those is that as the number of medical schools expands around a relatively fixed volume of highly desirable residency positions, I think it's silly if you try to tell applicants that it doesn't matter where they go to medical school. Unfortunately, I expect that increasingly it will. I honestly believe that the residency selection landscape is going to come to resemble the medical school application landscape, where there's a whole lot of variation in undergraduate experience, and admissions officers have to contend with that and take it into consideration when they're filling their class. And just like when you get into medical school, I mean, you absolutely can get into medical school if you don't have the shiniest name embossed on your college diploma. But every pre-med knows that you make it easier on yourself if you go to a university that has a well-established pre-med path. If you have experienced advisors, if you have high-quality science courses, your path to getting to medical school is certainly made easier. If you haven't seen it, the AAMC actually puts out a list of the undergraduate institutions that supply the largest number of matriculating medical schools each year. I'll link to this in the show notes. But you might ask yourself, why does the AAMC do this? I mean, why don't they just say, here's the overall admission rates to medical school, go wherever college you want, good luck? Why don't they say that? Now, of course, these data, they have to be interpreted with a grain of salt. The biggest confounding variable is the school size. You're going to expect that a bigger school is going to put more people in medical school than a small one. But even with that limitation, these are still useful data to pre-meds. They know if you go to UCLA or the University of Texas or the University of Florida and you want to go to medical school, well, it's not to say it's easy, but you can follow the well-worn path of the thousands of your peers who went before you. And of course, we know this happens in residency selection already in the current world. I stumbled upon a paper not long ago that showed that a third of urology residents come from just 20 medical schools. And I think that we're going to see those well-worn paths get even more well-worn in the future. And yes, it will still be possible for applicants with less advantaged educational backgrounds to follow their dreams, but they're going to have a narrow path to doing it. And I think applicants, they're entitled to know that. Another objection might be, well, but the data won't be meaningful, because even if the NRP makes a report, like I showed you a few slides ago, some applicants are still going to struggle to make heads or tails of it or apply it to their situation. And what if you're an applicant, you want to do ophthalmology or urology? Well, those specialties don't even use the NRP to match. So how are you going to figure out if somebody who matched in general surgery was actually crushed and horribly disappointed because they didn't match in urology? Or how are you going to know that some of the preliminary positions that don't have an advanced position, how are you going to know they're not applicants that are doing ophthalmology? I think this is still largely a bogus argument because to accept it, you'd have to conclude that applicants, if they can't have all the matching data, well, then they're better off having none of it. And that just doesn't make sense. And in reality, the NRMP handles 90% of the matches for most medical schools anyhow. So even if the SF match and the AUA match and the medical schools say they're not going to help the NRMP fill in the gaps or make their reports any more useful, well, they could still provide enough data that would be applicable to the vast majority of medical students. You could also object by saying, but people will misinterpret the data. And maybe we shouldn't report these data because some people might misinterpret them. You could have applicants who look at these figures and they say, oh, well, there's a 1 or 2% difference between match rates at these schools. So I should go here rather than there. And in actuality, those match rates are statistically speaking identical. But maybe they end up at the wrong medical school because of that, because they're hung up on these numbers. Um, or maybe you have people who don't appreciate that all of these statistics are subject to selection bias. So if a school gets their students excited about doing primary care and they have a larger than normal proportion of students who go into primary care specialties, well, their match rate overall is probably going to be higher than a school where they get the students excited about being a surgeon or an anesthesiologist or a radiologist. Even though if you want to do one of those specialties, you probably are still better off going to the school that has the lower overall match rate. So, yeah, I am I am certain that some people will misinterpret and overextend these statistics. But folks, they're going to do that anyhow. I mean, have you been on the internet lately? Have you existed in this world in which we now live? People will absolutely misinterpret data or twist it to serve their own conclusion. But hiding data is not going to keep them from doing it. There's a quote from Tim Harford that I like. He says, quote, yes, it's easy to lie with statistics, but it's even easier to lie without them, end quote. So I say we ditch the paternalism in favor of transparency, and we let people have the data, and they can use their own minds to decide what's in their best interest. Caveat emptor. Next up, but people will misuse the data. And here we're getting into some more credible objections because I think this absolutely will happen. It absolutely will be the case that premeds are not going to be the only ones who are interested in a school's residency placement rate. For instance, our old friends US News and World Report, they will certainly be interested in that, and they will definitely make it a component of their rankings. So I think you got to ask yourself, is that really a problem? I mean, out of all the things you could rank medical schools on, do we really want to keep doing it the way we have? With acceptance rates or undergraduate GPA or how much NIH grant money they got? Out of all the things that you could use to rank schools, measuring how often the school students get the kind of job they want after graduation sounds like a pretty reasonable choice to me. Now, other people might worry that these data will get misused for school accreditation. Maybe the LCME or COCA will decide to set some arbitrary threshold for what the match rate should be, and they'll just penalize schools that don't hit the mark. And I think that's a real fear. We've seen that happen with the ACGME and program board pass rates. But I think the same logic applies. If there's a medical school that's really struggling to place its graduates in residency, isn't that something that an accrediting body should want to explore, at least a little bit? Next, but it violates student confidentiality. And this is also a legitimate concern because unless we're very careful about how we report these data, they could compromise student confidentiality. Some specialties are small. You don't have a whole lot of applicants each year. If a school has one student who applies to a certain specialty, then reporting the match rate doesn't just tell me something about the school, it tells me something about that student. And it's probably something the student doesn't want splashed across the World Wide Web. But there are still simple ways around this. I mean, the NRMP can and should report specialty-specific data, but they should do it for multiple years, just like I did in the example above. I mean, in that I use 5 years. So we're not just looking at 1 year of otolaryngology statistics. We're looking at multiple cycles. And if you do have low numbers, like less than 5 or 10 applicants, well, I think it's fair to just not report those at all. But even not reporting it would still be useful to applicants because if you have your heart set on being an interventional radiologist and you're looking at a medical school and they have no data listed, well, then they've had fewer than 5 or 10 applicants who have attempted to match. And you might still reasonably choose to go to a school where they have a match rate to report. So even no data would still tell you something. And so I think that this concern is also overblown. Next, but it'll make the match more stressful. We don't want to make the match any more stressful than it already is. But if this proposal that we're discussing, if that went through, now you'd have a world in which every medical school's match outcomes, they're going to be tracked and they're going to be published. They're going to be on display for the whole world to see. But I think if we're being honest, the only group that this is going to make things more stressful for is school officials. Because being honest, for applicants, the match is already about as high stakes as it gets. I mean, the NRMP can write a report about it or not, but students already know their future livelihood is on the line. And they know that not everybody is going to get what they want. Next, schools will try to game the system. Now we're getting into the real meat of it. I think there are some legitimate worries that a policy like this would cause unintended consequences because, just like I discussed a moment ago, if you track match outcomes by school, schools are going to try to game the system. Still, I think if the NRMP is careful and fair about the data points they report, I think that most of these will take care of themselves. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Say the NRMP just decided to report match rate. Well, then schools would have an incentive to push students into less competitive specialties that they don't really want, just to pump the numbers. But if the NRMP actually reported the distribution of specialties, pushing people into specialties that they don't want becomes a double-edged sword. You still could have schools that say, I want to see a 100% match rate. I want every M4 to apply to at least 3 community family medicine programs as a backup. And, like I said before, if a school made that policy, it would serve no one, not the applicant, not the program who gets the backup application, not the patients, nobody. But if you report the distribution of specialties that people match into, well, schools now sort of have an incentive to support the students who want to chase their dreams. Because if a student is successful, the school gets to share in that success. They get to look appealing to people who want to be future OBGYNs when they see that a large number of people going to that school matched an OBGYN. And actually, I could imagine some schools that would embrace this, and they would just say openly, yeah, we've got some students who don't match, but at the end of the day, we're here for our students. We want our students to follow their dreams, and we're going to support them in every way possible. I think the same logic applies to fears that schools would pressure applicants to take PGY1 only medicine or surgery positions. I think, yeah, sure, some schools might. But the natural counterbalance is that these outcomes would show up in the statistics. And it's really just not going to make your school look real good if you have a lot of applicants that are ending up in dead-end PGY1 only positions. I think a more realistic concern would be that schools would try to prevent weaker applicants from even applying for the match. I mean, if you're a dean and you're looking at your class and you're thinking that 2% of your students are going to be very hard to place in residency, well, maybe you just fail them out and then they don't count against you. Now, if you want to play devil's advocate with this, you could. You could choose to make the case that maybe that's not a bad thing either. I mean, maybe now medical schools are passing along students who really shouldn't be graduated. And, maybe this would increase medical school standards. And if it did, that wouldn't be a bad thing, would it? Medical school admissions committees, they're good, but they're not infallible. They let some people in who maybe they shouldn't be let in. Maybe a little more attrition is desirable. You could make that argument. I'm not going to. Um, because even though there may be a grain of truth in there somewhere, I think this one is probably a legitimate concern. Students getting forced out after they've incurred debt and wasted years of their life, it's already a big problem at many Caribbean medical schools where attrition rates may be as high as 30 or 50% for the off-brand schools. But this is an area, at least for US medical schools, where the LCME and COCA could be helpful because they can and they should require schools to report graduation or attrition rates. And you could just put that side by side with the match results. So yeah, your school maybe had a 95% match rate, but if it did it by having 10 or 15% attrition, that would be obvious to anyone who looks at the numbers. A final concern, which again is also legitimate, is that schools would try to game the system by pumping up the evaluations of their students to help them match. So you'll have more schools that remove grades and class rank and any other measure of comparative performance, and you'll have more exaggerated and flowery and inflated letters of recommendation and MSPEs. So, yes, I think this is also a legitimate concern, but to decide how seriously to weigh it in making our final decision, it sort of requires us to make a realistic appraisal of where we are now. And, if you look around now, how much worse do you think it's going to get? I mean, schools right now, they already have an incentive to sweep problems under the rug and present their students in the most favorable light possible. I got a question for you. If you review applications, how many MSPEs have you read that contain any critical comments? I'm somebody who read a lot of them this past year, and I can tell you, not very many. And so, yes, I'm sure it can get worse. It can always get worse. Maybe we're going to start getting letters of recommendation that say that each student is just the next Osler, that they healed the sick with just their touch. And then after they did that, they turned some water into wine and fed everybody a nice bread and fish lunch. I just don't really think that we're going to lose that much discrimination compared to what we have now. Because as I've articulated in previous videos, I think the solution for this problem is for program directors to stand up and to demand the type of information that they want and be willing to pass over applicants whose schools refuse or decline to provide that information. If you want more on that, watch my last Journal Club video and I'll link to it in the notes below. But my point is, if you care about this problem, let me put it to you that it's not a problem that you're going to fix by withholding data. There's a better solution than just not providing useful information to premeds because you think that if you provide it, you're going to make a bad problem get 10% worse. And that brings me to my last objection. But schools don't want it. I think that if you went around and you asked medical school deans and you said, hey, do you want the NRMP to make a charting outcomes report for your school showing how your applicants fared in residency placement and facilitating comparisons to peer institutions? I think most deans would say, well, actually, no, I don't want that. And they may have different reasons for saying no. They may have sincere worries about some of the points that I mentioned above, and they may honestly and truly believe that it's a net negative for the world if the NRMP reported these data. But even if they have legitimate objections, I would bet that they exist with a strong sentiment for self-preservation. You know, you don't become a dean of a medical school by being unaware of how people perceive you. And one of your important job tasks is to take that same skill and apply it to your institution. You want to protect and develop and improve your school's brand if you're the big dean. And this is the reality of having a third party like the NRMP report your match data. It is a mathematical certainty that 50% of schools are going to be shown to have below average match outcomes. So 50% of schools right off the bat, they're going to be unhappy. They're not going to be real pleased with the NRMP. And even that 50% of schools that have above average match outcomes, well, most of them, they're still going to be unhappy because it's unlikely that the NRMP statistics are going to make the school look as good as they could have if the school was just free to frame their match statistics however they wanted. It's hard to beat 100% match rate across all three campuses. And I don't mean to suggest there's something nefarious about deans who might feel this way. They're just doing their job. Part of their job is to look out for the school's brand. They got a duty, just like an attorney looking out for their client. But all this becomes relevant if you're the NRMP because the match, it's not the law. It's a voluntary thing. And it's not really smart if you're sitting at the NRMP to enact policies that alienate half or more of the schools that train your match participants. Every now and then, you hear some rumblings that certain residency programs or entire specialties, they're frustrated with the way things are. And you hear somebody say, well, maybe we should leave the NRMP. We've heard that a fair bit over the past couple of years for different reasons from different specialties. And again, there's no law that says that programs have to use the NRMP. Specialties could use a different matching service. They could break off and go to the SF match and say, hey, we want you to run our match because we don't like the way such and such is being done over here. Or they could make their own. They could set up their own matching service. That might have been impossible 50 years ago because, the technical expertise that was required was considerable. But, nowadays you could run the matching algorithm itself on your personal computer. I'm not kidding. I mean, you can download the Roth-Parenson algorithm as a Python extension on GitHub. So, even though the NRMP provides a service that's valued by programs and by applicants, it still is a service that's replaceable. It could be provided by someone else. and it may not be in their best interest to antagonize the deans by providing data that they don't want to be provided. And here I'm going to be honest, this idea I've presented here, it's a good idea. It might even be a great idea. It could be that I am such a genius that the first time that this great idea has ever been spoken into the world is this very day, and you get to share it with me. But in reality, this idea is probably something that's been considered and discussed in rooms full of important people in the past. And for this reason, and maybe some of the others that I've mentioned, it's not been pursued. But I don't think it's a hopeless cause. The NRMP's had new leadership over the past few years. And, that leadership has been more willing to implement some policies that previously they wouldn't have touched. Look at the collection of demographic data that started last year. That's a risky policy. That really has the potential to threaten many programs that are biased and bigoted in the ways that they evaluate their residents. And look, I've got some issues with the way that the NRMP has chosen to analyze and present the data, and maybe I'll talk about those in a different video. But I want to be clear: the fact that they began doing this, it's a step in the right direction. And I think this is a similar thing. The NRMP, they can provide these data, and actually they should. Their mission statement, their reason for being, it says to match healthcare professionals to graduate medical education and advanced training programs through a process that's fair, equitable, efficient, transparent, and reliable. So I say, be transparent. Provide the data that only you can provide. Present those data cleanly and honestly, and let them speak for themselves. Premeds deserve it. And that's all I've got to say about that. Thanks again for listening.